Good afternoon. Welcome. We're entering the final stretch of the 2021 annual meeting of the American Council of Learned Societies. I'm Joy Connolly, honored to serve as president of ACLS, and I want to thank all attendees of our meeting so far for your time and attention. That means I'm speaking of the council itself, the Learned Society executive directors, the representatives of our consortium and associate member schools, our board members, valued partners, and friends. We're grateful to all of you for your presence and support. I want to especially thank Sandra Bradley, Director of Governance and Society Relations, for leading the team that made this meeting possible. The expertise they've acquired with Zoom, really amazing over the course of the year, has made this and many other online experiences at ACLS wonderfully smooth. Sandra also organized the events anchoring the close of yesterday and today, starting with the marvelous world premiere performance last night by Awadagin Pratt, just hours before he appeared in Miami with the New World Symphony and the Human Rights Watch in an event called Being Black in America. His piece yesterday was thrilling and beautiful, and his confidence in the future of classical music made the perfect midpoint for a gathering of humanists and interpretive social scientists who sometimes worry about the future of our fields too. I hope you can join us this afternoon for the intriguing spoken word event produced by the Georgetown Global Lab that will bring our meeting to a creative close. Of course, I hope to see many of you in person next year and not over a screen, public health allowing. But I hope I'll also be able to draw on the resources of the internet to communicate with a larger group of people who aren't able to join us in Philadelphia. This past year, together with Sandra Bradley, whom I mentioned earlier, and our communications director, Heather Mangrum, and our chief development officer, Mary Richter, we used Zoom to launch our new public programming for Humanistic Scholarship in the 21st century. Fall 2020 saw the first events of a year-long series on the experiences of Black and Brown scholars in the United States. Practically speaking, our new attention to faraway audiences means our meeting next year will be different in some way from pre-pandemic meetings. It's too early to say exactly how, but I can say that the experiences of the past year have committed us at ACLS to finding creative ways to reach as many people as possible and to welcome them. So we'll need to adjust our expectations a bit, stretch beyond what we're used to so that we can enjoy one another's living company, those of us who are in Philadelphia, while devoting serious energy to figuring out how to welcome and engage scholars who are caregivers, scholars with limited finances, scholars with disabilities, and everyone who's benefited from the community created by Zoom since March 2020. Having now spent nearly 2 years at ACLS, it's difficult to believe how time has flown. I think this is the most important lesson I've learned so far. The importance of generating community that finds the right balance between stability and not stagnation, comfort and familiarity without complacency. This kind of community requires us to take a close look at familiar habits, to check that we're being attentive to those who are new to our groups or still learning to navigate the weather, or whose past experiences, whether individually or as a member of a historically disadvantaged group, incline them with reason to be wary of their welcome. Over a century ago, Emil Durkheim argued that organized groups are humanity's creative response to, and I quote, deep and lasting needs. He also recognized that groups have a tendency to turn inward and to start bending to the interests of the most influential and comfortable members. Durkheim nonetheless insisted that if and when a group fails its members, this is grounds for reforming it, and I quote again, not for declaring it useless for all time and seeking to destroy it. He believed, as I do, that the advantages of change and reform outweigh the difficulties of starting from scratch. And this applies, in my view, to learned societies, to colleges and universities, and to ACLS itself. I don't need to remind anybody here that we're living through really challenging times. No individual student, independent scholar, faculty member, department, or even individual school is in a position to cope effectively with the ongoing effects of a pandemic or the decline of public trust in colleges and universities and in scholarship or knowledge itself. At the same time, we live in a competitive hierarchical culture in this country and in academia. Scholars, departments, divisions, and schools often work in isolation. Those of you who read my monthly newsletters, one of the new practices we established last year, know that with the help of the Henry Luce Foundation, we've set up a design workshop for a new academy at ACLS. This is a gathering of over 50 individuals committed to progress through change. At our first meeting earlier this month, the competitive fragmentation of academia was a main and major serious theme. We remarked, all of us, on the insidious ways it builds on our individual experiences of doing solitary research, of going it alone, as people say, or being thrown into the deep end of a project, that for many of us was how we were initiated into the academy. Individual scholars compete for attention and status in their fields. Departments within schools compete for limited funds. Schools compete for tuition dollars and students and top faculty. In one design workshop discussion I sat in on, the participants noted that many of the academic initiatives that are successful these days, those that are welcoming new and diverse students at all levels, that are finding funding, that are reinvigorating faculty, that are getting trustees and higher administration to take notice, these are also the ones that demand the most collaboration, often across schools and institutions or between faculty and local communities. But all these things bump right up against the structures and habits formed over generations of isolation, competition, and fragmentation. So thinking this through, the design group I was listening to agreed that we need a new model of collective action in the academy. There was a moment of silence after this statement was made. And then another participant said into the quiet, "Yes, we certainly do. But at my school, we can't even get permission within our own departments to co-teach." So at ACLS, we are privileged to be connected to many different individuals and groups, schools and societies. And we have a compelling track record of gatherings and collaborations that help mitigate the worst effects of this isolation and competitive fragmentation. And I find real inspiration in this history. When we were consulting with hundreds of people in the course of designing the strategic plan last year, and then when we were finalizing that plan just as the pandemic hit, I turned to the minutes of the annual meetings from the 1940s, a time of war and intense worry. In the past few months, I've buried myself instead in minutes from the 1930s. At first, and some ACLS staff may remember my comments as I was reading through these archives, I was startled and even appalled to see in them virtually no reference to the depression and the suffering it was causing. It's easy, and frankly, I think it's reasonable to look with a pretty skeptical eye at the comfortable, tenured, white, close to all male gatherings of the council in the early 1930s. Still, when I dug deeper into what the group sought to do, I saw a compelling bunch of projects, a good many of them designed to encourage scholars pushing boundaries and designed to create community where clearly there was none. So there was talk of funding, and there was indeed funding of projects in early Latin paleography, a topic closer to my heart as a classicist, early modern Romance language, epic and song, an edition of Grotius, all of these important projects, and as it's turned out, projects with enduring impacts. They established new committees as well, this group, this council, our predecessors, one on Indic and Iranian studies, and one organizing research on Native American languages with a special emphasis on rescuing the vanishing indigenous languages of Latin America. The council also worked on the challenge of translating scholarship being produced in China, with the goal of making it accessible to American scholars and students without Chinese. They wrote, "Occidental textbooks will still go on repeating the same old inaccuracies, misunderstandings, and falsifications about Chinese civilization and history that disfigure them now." There was also an ambitious proposal to bring large numbers of people, including members of the public, together at conferences to generate a comprehensive history of, and I quote, "the ideas underlying modern civilization." And this was a conversation that ultimately produced the Journal of the History of Ideas, whose board, by a happy coincidence, I sit on today. The sheer creative array of projects represents the diversity of study across the humanities and interpretive social sciences that ACLS will always support. Most interesting to me from these 1930s minutes is the way the council used their connections to link people together to take action, scholars in schools across the country and around the world. My point in reviewing all of this is not to make us feel complacent and comfortable in our past history. Rather, I'm prompted to say, and I hope I'm prompting you to think, that like our predecessors, but with more intention to inclusivity, we're making it a habit to think outside ourselves and what's familiar to us, to ask who and what is or might be missing from the academic table and how we might work together to supply it. One of our most important communities is our community of fellows. The strategic plan we announced exactly 1 year ago identified as one of our most pressing priorities the support of outstanding scholars in conditions of precarity. With the board's approval, we directed all central fellowships awarded in the 2020-2021 competition to emerging scholars without tenure. This year, we're proud to say that 50% of these central fellowships were awarded to scholars not on the tenure track, who are devoted to making progress on their research, whether they're employed inside or outside the academy, in contingent posts or lectureships, or some other work entirely. While we advocate for better job conditions for all, we aim to recognize excellence everywhere. We also started 2 new emergency programs in response to COVID for recent PhDs. The Leading Edge Fellowship, generously made possible by the Henry Luce Foundation and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Emerging Voices Fellowship, funded by our ACLS endowment. You'll hear more about these programs in the conversation we'll start in just a couple of minutes. The inequities exacerbated and exposed by the pandemic and protested by the Black Lives Matter movement last spring and summer sparked our decision to devote ourselves last year to improving equity and inclusion in our daily work, our public presentation, and our general strategy. Last fall and winter, we embarked on an anti-racism initiative with the expert assistance of an advisory group made up of past fellows and university faculty and board members, and Samira Abdul Karim, leader of the Brooklyn-based firm Hyphens and Spaces. All that experience affirmed to us that to strengthen ACLS for the short and the long term, we'll continue to expand our work to include strengthening the infrastructure of the humanities and interpretive social sciences through change-oriented policy work and public events. Successful problem-solving groups like this very group I'm speaking with, attendees of our annual meeting, will help consolidate our identity as a community builder and as a valuable collaborative advocate across academia. COVID, which of course started in March 2020, as we all know, has left its mark everywhere. As I take stock of the past year and think about the many initiatives and projects we began, the fellows we supported, the fellowship programs we stewarded, and you're about to hear more about this in the next half hour, I want to take my final moment in speaking with you on my own to note how exceedingly fortunate I am and my ACLS colleagues who have given unstintingly of their time, energy, and goodwill, despite the stress and worry caused by the pandemic and by the unfamiliar pressures of working from home. I salute their hard work in every use of the word I or we in what I've just said to you and what we'll continue to say in our conversation in the next few minutes. I want to end, as I often tend to do, because it makes me think and makes my brain work in different directions, with an excerpt from one of my favorite poets, which I quoted in a monthly newsletter a few months ago. This is Muriel Rukeyser's poem, I Lived in the First Century of World Wars. She says, in the day, I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened, as the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means to wake. Thank you, all of you, for your interest and support of ACLS and for thinking differently with us about an exciting future that lies ahead.